So, ladies and gentlemen, what we are discussing today is very much an unknown territory, but at the same time, let me also say that I've been asked to emphasize by the labor relations practitioners out there. I've been asked to emphasize to you the fact that indeed there is nothing new to what is required of you in the working environment. When it comes to labor relations practices, it is very, very much business as usual in terms of how you're running your labor relations affairs. And indeed, the entire intention of this activity is to test, I suppose, the veracity of your labor relations policies, your labor relations processes, and in fact, the precedents that have been set within your organization up until now. Obviously, there will be new components which creep into your labor relations policy guidelines and practices. And obviously, and I want to start off by asking you to understand the following term. In labor law, in fact, in all law, there is the notion of the difference between a dispute or an issue, which is an issue of interest, as opposed to an issue of right. And when it comes to many of the things we are dealing with around how you manage coronavirus in your workplace, many of these issues are going to be issues of rights rather than interest. And it's important that you understand this distinction because in reality, anything that has to do with an interest is not a rule, it's not a regulation, it's not a law, it's not even a common practice in your workplace. In fact, what it is an opportunity to engage, an opportunity to establish regulation, and then to begin talking about how you're going to enforce that regulation. Now, it's critically important that right from the very beginning you understand that. On the other hand, there are many things which one would expect, because coronavirus is new, which one would expect to be new in labor law, which in fact is not new in labor law. One of the things I'm going to do for all of those people who've attended, I'm going to send you a list of resources. Resources starting off with 5 interviews that I've conducted with a number of lawyers, a couple of insurance practitioners around some of the topics we're talking about today, as well as articles that they've written on the subject. And you'll see very quickly that a lot of what we're going to be discussing today has to do with interest, but a lot equally has to do with rights. Rights you've already established, rights which are already entrenched in your policy and procedure manual, in your labor relations manual, and in fact, which your managers hopefully by now have been trained simply to be managing in terms of industrial relations in your workplace. And I think it's critically important that as a senior manager in your organization, you very quickly learn to distinguish the one from the other. The other point up front that I want to be making to you is it's critically important that at this stage you reflect a true understanding of the difference between what we call competency on the one hand and behavior on the other. A lot of what we're doing around coronavirus has far more to do with behavior and the behavior of you as the owners and managers of your business, behavior of the people who work in your businesses, and the interaction of one with the other and with peers. That all has to do with behavior, the kind of thing you shouldn't have to teach people in the workplace, but the fact that you've employed adults into the workplace, the kinds of things which should be taken for granted, but unfortunately are not necessarily taken for granted. I was saying to someone this morning that I don't know if you've seen the viral post going around on Facebook around what's happened over the last couple of days at Sun City, and specifically the Valley of Waves, where in fact a whole lot of young people congregated there, literally packed on top of each other, shouting and chanting, coronavirus, 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 which is exactly the opposite behavior of social distancing. And that very often can be said of young people and, the whole rebellious attitude. But that is an issue of behavior. It's not an issue of performance. And critically important that you distinguish that in your workplace. And let me just say right at the very beginning, this is not an issue endemic to South Africa. It's something that's happening all over the world. If you look at America and you look specifically at Florida and how people are packing onto the beaches there, as if there's been no call for social distancing, etc. So we're not here today to judge. We're not here today to talk about statistics. We're here today to talk about your response as employers in the workplace to, in fact, what is going on. So the first point on the agenda that I put out there was the notion of what obligations of company directors and senior managers need to be. In the resource list that I send you, there are two specific interviews I want you to listen to. The one is with John Buerta, and the other is with Premi Natesan, who is CEO of the Institute of Directors, because they both talk about senior management and specifically board obligations in getting your company ready to deal with coronavirus. And critically important as well is I want you to think as senior managers about consequence. So remember now that we do have the criminalization of bad behavior, if you want it, which in fact has been promulgated very quickly here in South Africa. In other words, willful negligence, willful infection of others is a criminalized offense now in South Africa. The legislation has been placed. And it's critically important that you understand that and therefore understand your obligations as a chief executive officer that I'm going to be talking about now, or in fact as a board of directors. You cannot say this is a social issue that government was taking care of or should have taken care of. It's incumbent on you to, in fact, be dealing with these issues now in your workplace in real time. So the first issue is essentially having a strategic plan for your business, and the notion that in that strategic plan, there has to be clear communication about guidelines that you've established in your business. It doesn't have to be a long document, but it has to show that you've applied your mind. And it has to talk about things like social distancing. You need to be well aware of the fact, for example, that there is a absolute number that has been set by legislation in South Africa that says that at any moment in time, there cannot be more than 100 people in your business, because your business can, for all intents and purposes, be regarded as a social gathering. And we are restricted to 100 people in a social gathering or 50 people in a restaurant kind of an environment for the time being. And we know that this is a very fluid number. We know that the president will in fact be addressing the nation very shortly in the course of the next couple of hours, and that number might in fact change. The number around the world is in fact a lot less than 100. If it goes down to 50, it becomes even more important for you to have a proper policy in place in your organization, because what it means is that at any moment in time, you cannot have more than 50 people within your working environment. And in a medium to a large size company, if you think about the people who work, the people who clean, your customers, your transportation and logistics chain within your business, it's very possible that any moment in time you exceed the number of 15. Now, this is something that your security guards need to become acutely aware of. And in fact, you need to start counting people within that environment. Because if you don't, it's not just the criminal liability in your company which becomes important for you to consider, but it's the insurance liability. Because make no mistake, insurance companies, and there is an interview with one of the partners at Webber Wentzel Linkletter specifically on insurance and your insurance company, that will be in the resource list I send you that I urge you to listen to. They're not long interviews, they're between 5 and 10 minutes each. But the important point is, if you do not keep track of the number of people in your working environment, and it goes above that number, then in fact you run the risk of invalidating any kind of insurance you have within your working environment. But more importantly, if in the process then your employees become infected or become test positive, and they claim that it's because of exposure within your working environment, you possibly, potentially even invalidate the notion of workman's compensation and become as a company then personally liable to cover that kind of insurance if you are not following the rules, if you are not following the laws. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to be running a government gazette hotline as we speak, which means that on a daily basis, as government gazettes around these topics get published, so I'm going to alert you to those government gazettes, and I'm going to try and explain how those government gazettes then impact in your working environment on your daily practices. Please just read the alerts as and when I send them out. I think it's critically important that you keep apprised of what's going on. So social distancing, very, very important. Social distancing, there's a social standard, a social norm that says at least a meter, if not 2 meters apart from individuals. They shouldn't be concentrated in areas of more than 5 people at a time in a particular room, in a particular environment, which means that from a shift perspective, you need to look at your shifts. You need to look at how you divide up the work process within your shifts. And you need to know that you might need to be doubling up on shifts and therefore cutting down on the number of people on each particular shift at any moment in time. This requires a strategic review of your workplaces, and for you and your senior management team to be documenting just the rules. It doesn't need paragraphs and paragraphs of gumph, but it needs you to look at the rules, common practices in your environment, and to be documenting those common practices. I don't need to tell you by now that there are massive hygiene requirements, and you'll be able to read those hygiene requirements in the articles which are going to be sent to you from the people that I've interviewed. John Buerter, Johan Olafir, they all talk about those hygiene requirements. So please have a look at those hygiene requirements. But you know them by now. It's washing of the hands. It's using hand sanitizer. It's making sure that people touch their faces as little as possible. It's certainly making sure that if there is regular interaction between people, there is some kind of a prevention of spit, some kind of a prevention of the interchange of fluids, which ordinarily would be masks. But remember, and please, this is critically important for you to bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about masks, remember that what the masks are there to do is to stop people infecting other people, not necessarily to stop people wearing those masks being infected by other people. So it very much is a one-way process in that regard. And you need to be acutely aware of the limitations of having masks in the workplace. But the question is, should you be making masks available to your employees? Not only should you be, but you should be having a policy that says they have to wear those masks at all times when they're in that environment. And then from a hand sanitizing point of view, you have to make hand sanitizer available to people, and therefore you have to make free-flowing water available to people as well in terms of cleaning of the hands. In terms of quarantine, let's talk about quarantine in your strategic plan. You have to address things like voluntary quarantine, where people decide to put themselves into voluntary quarantine, not because they are medically positive, but simply because they believe they've been exposed to someone who might be positive. Now, the problem with voluntary quarantine, where someone has made a decision to put themselves into quarantine, is it doesn't activate. And when I say it doesn't activate, what I mean is it doesn't activate the important things like, and I will be referring to it later on in the course of this discussion, but it doesn't activate things like unemployment insurance fund, which is now available, officially available, to cover medically caused quarantine of 14 days or longer. It doesn't activate when people go into voluntary self-quarantine. It doesn't activate that. And more importantly, as a policy on voluntary self-quarantine in a company ordinarily, unless you are going to make exigency decisions. A policy on voluntary self-quarantine means that the chain of leave kicks in, which is paid leave and then unpaid leave. Sick leave does not factor into the notion of voluntary quarantine. I need to emphasize this fact because there seems to be a massive misunderstanding amongst employers that if your staff go into voluntary self-quarantine because they feel they've been exposed to someone who might be positive, that doesn't ordinarily activate sick leave. You can voluntarily decide that it does activate sick leave, and it is a caution that what you have to understand is that sick leave will run out, normal leave will kick in, and therefore you should reserve sick leave for the great unknown, which is what happens when there is a medically caused quarantine that has to be taking place. If it is a medically caused quarantine, by the way, that is what activates the unemployment insurance fund kicking in at 70% from day one of that self-quarantine. And I'll talk about that in a little while. And on the resource list, I will also send you the Government Gazette dealing with the extension of the UIF, Unemployment Insurance Fund, to in fact cover medically induced quarantine. And then, of course, medical quarantine, we're beyond the 14-day period, which is not just about exposure. And let me explain what I'm trying to say. If I go to the hospital, I'm tested positive, the hospital asks me for a list of people I've come into contact with. The hospital then phone those people and say, you need to go into self-imposed quarantine. Would you like a letter from the hospital to that effect? That will cover, the way it's currently defined, that will cover UIF covering that self-quarantine, if I can put it that way. The Department of Labor has said, however, that they reserve the right to restrict that based on numbers and their exposure to numbers once UIF does kick in. So we're going to have to wait to see if that is moderated. My instinct is that it will be moderated because there'll be far too many people in self-imposed medically indicated quarantine and far more people who are going to require unemployment insurance fund who are in medically indicated quarantine because they have tested positive. So you do need to understand the distinction between the two. But if your staff member is phoned, then, and this should be in your strategic communication to your staff as well, if they're phoned to say that they've been in contact with someone who's tested positive, should go into 14 days of self-quarantine, then in fact, they should be asking for a medical certificate or a letter from the hospital that's phoned them or some kind of an indicator, formal indicator, because as things stand at the moment, they would then be covered by UIF, but not necessarily down the line. Your obligation to your employees is to give them leave in either of those two instances, whether they put themselves into quarantine because they have an instinct that they've come into contact with someone who's positive, or whether they've been phoned and been asked to go into self-imposed quarantine because a hospital has said this person has tested positive, you've had contact with this person, therefore you should go into quarantine. But your obligation to those individuals is you have to give them leave. You cannot withhold the leave. However, it would be ordinary leave which is due to them. If it is medically indicated because they are positive, then in fact it would be classified as sick leave. So I do need to distinguish those two. If it is medically indicated because they've tested positive, it would classify as sick leave. If it's medically indicated because they've come into contact with someone who's tested positive, they're not necessarily classified as sick leave. You can voluntarily, as a company, decide to classify it as sick leave. But again, I'm asking you to be seriously cognizant of the fact that you shouldn't be giving sick leave away because you're going to need to store it for each of those individuals down the line. Wits University this morning came out with a very, very bleak prognostication, and that is that if we can't get behavior right in this country, then in fact within 40 days we could be looking at 1 million people who are testing positive. Now, whether or not that's 1 million or 500,000 or even 100,000 people testing positive, it is going to affect you in your workplace, in your workforce, in the workplace, and therefore you're going to need to store that sick leave and not allow employees to go straight to paid leave, which might due to them, or when that paid leave runs out, go straight to unpaid leave, as the chain of leave, in fact, will become evident. There again, I ask you to listen to the interviews with John Buerta and Johan Olivier. They both speak about that chain of leave that you need to be cognizant about. Before I carry on, any questions? Anybody want to ask any question? Okay, no questions. Let's carry on. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to unmute everybody just in case there is someone who wants to ask a question, and I'm going to ask that question again.
Can you hear me, Ivan?
Yes, who is that?
It's Brian Randall.
Hello, Brian Randall. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, thanks, mate. Two things. The volume on your talk is going down. I think that's because there's more people joining, or maybe you moved away from it, right?
Okay.
And secondly, thank you. And secondly, the unpaid leave follows automatically, or do you have to advise them that it's now unpaid leave?
You have. So, Brian, thank you for that question. In your policy document, your communication document to your staff, you want to be very, very clear about what will be regarded as paid and unpaid leave. And the chain of leave should always be that we require you to exhaust the normal leave that is due to you. You might, as a benevolent employer, you might decide that what you want to do, you might decide that what you want to do as a benevolent employer is to give half of the leave that they need to take as paid, and half of the leave that they need to take as free leave, if I can put it that way. If, on the other hand, what you want to do is you want to restrict leave to paid leave and then to free leave, to unpaid leave, you need to say in your policy document that should you need to take leave for any reason to do with coronavirus, which is either medically cautioned or, in fact, of your own volition, that what you have to do is you first have to take your leave, which is due, and then you have to take unpaid leave. But under no circumstances will we want or can we permit you to take a leave, in fact, which is going to be regarded as coming from the company. Having said that, if you are a benevolent employer, then you are fully entitled to supplement the leave, to tell them that what we're doing is we're adding 5 days leave on, which will be paid leave, simply because of the fact that we care for you, we want to be seen to be caring for you, etc., etc. So it's absolutely up to you in that regard, but you have to be aware that you need to specify it in your policy document. You cannot veer from labor relations practices, which are either covered by a bargaining council agreement, the Labor Relations Act, or the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, unless you have specified it in your agreement, number one. Number two, you cannot take anything away from your employees. Again, you cannot take anything away from your employees unless it is by mutual agreement. It cannot be a unilateral, which means only you doing it, a unilateral change to their basic conditions of employment. Normal labor relations prevails in your working environment. Remember as well, if you're in a unionized environment, your point of engagement has to be with the trade union rather than with the shop stewards or with the employees. Unless the trade union has said to you, we're so snowed under, work with your shop stewards and they will check with us. So you need to understand that that's the chain of command that you're establishing within the organization, that you need to keep going in the organization. Again, it is critically important that you understand that. Any questions, again, any questions in that regard, because it is critically important that everybody understands that. All right. Again, I'm going to unmute you just in case. Aggie, anything from your side? I see that your microphone is
Nothing
going.
from my side. It's fully understood. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Let's then move on. Just do that. Let's then move on. All right. So moving on there, the medical quarantine, which is indefinite, does this to the leave provision. It kicks in with sick leave, which is due, which is, as you know, 36 days in the 3-year cycle. It then kicks in with normal leave, which would be due to the person. And only on expiration of those two will it be kicking in with unpaid leave. What you have to understand, and what I want to implore you, because 2 employers that I deal with have already asked me this question. If a staff member is off for more than 14 days of medically caused leave, can I invoke the principle of incapacity? Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me say this to you. Legally, of course, you can invoke the principle of incapacity. However, should a matter like this come to the CCMA or come to the Labour Court, there is no doubt in my mind that, in fact, whatever you've decided in terms of incapacity will be suspended, even if the charge of incapacity was something that you had initiated before this coronavirus thing broke, you will not be entitled to invoke claims of incapacity at this moment in time that stand up in the CCMA and the Bargaining Council in any arbitration forum, or in fact in the labor court. Now, that's not the law talking, that's my instinct talking, simply because of the fact that no commissioner, no judge, no arbitrator is going to want to be the person who says, in a cold-blooded way, I allowed this company to get away with extending the definition of incapacity to cover a reasonable period of downtime because of coronavirus. So again, from a strategy point of view, you might want to start considering the notion, when does downtime because of coronavirus, where we are not in lockdown as a country, when does that downtime begin to be justified as incapacity which deserves dismissal? There's no science to it. It is an art. It is unfortunately something you need to start thinking about. What the arbitrators will always ask is, if the person was on unpaid leave, should you have the right to invoke incapacity? Your answer could be, our production cycle is still going on. We've got too many people down because of essentially incapacity, and therefore we have to bring people in to do the job. Again, the answer would be, but you're not paying those individuals, so why not bring people in to do the job on a temporary basis and give the person an opportunity to recover? It is an art. It is not a science. It is a dispute of interest. It is not a dispute of right that we are having to deal with at this moment in time. And it is for that reason that I'm bringing it to your attention to say to you that there is no right and there's no wrong. It's how you justify it. It's how you communicate it. And I think importantly, it's in creating a forum for engagement with your staff where it can be communicated and you can hear the thing out. All right. Again, I'm going to unmute because I see one or two people wanting to put their hands up. And feel free, ladies and gentlemen, to put your hands up if you do want to. There's a little bit of background noise, but we'll carry on in an unmuted fashion. All right. Guys, your strategic policy needs to take account of the difference between an individual going for testing, an individual being found negative, and then an individual being found positive. So it's critically important that your policy makes allowance for people who want to be tested to be tested. The Institute of Virology does make allowance for tests to be conducted on site. There is a helpline number. I will get that helpline number to you. And in fact, they are very, very accommodating. And they will send people on site for your entire staff complement to be tested. And my recommendation is that, in fact, you do organize for testing, for bulk testing to take place on site. Do not expect, however, do not expect that you will be communicated the results of the testing back as a company. That is not going to be happening. Each individual will be communicated their results back individually, and you cannot force an individual to give you the results of the test, although you can request it. You cannot force them to give you the results of the test. Let me finally, on your strategic plan that you need to communicate to your staff and you need to communicate to your customers as well, but let me go back to this issue of criminal exposure. It is an untested territory at this moment in time, whether the National Prosecuting Authority will prosecute, whether they can handle a number of prosecutions which might result from so many people, in fact, just arbitrarily exposing other people when they know they are positive, not exposing. One of the policy considerations you have to stipulate, even if it's the only thing you put up on your notice board, is the following. You automatically need to notify us if you test positive. We would appreciate you telling us if you test negative as well, by the way, because it means we know we can deploy you and use you in different areas. But you automatically need to notify us if you test positive. You automatically need to take leave from this organization and go into quarantine in one way or another if you test positive. And please, we need your medical certificate in that regard to know how long you have been told to go into self-exile. Because remember, the 14 days is an indicative period of time. It isn't the legislated period of time. There are instances where the results are so strong that a medical doctor or hospital will say go into self-imposed quarantine for a minimum of 21 days rather than 14 days, sometimes even longer. If the symptoms are severe, then the individual will in fact be admitted to a quarantine facility. In your strategic plan and your communication channels back to your staff, be very, very clear to say to them that you have to notify us if you are in self-imposed quarantine, medically imposed quarantine, or in fact, if you've been admitted to an institution which is a quarantine institution. If you do not notify us, but you disappear from the working environment, after the second day, we will regard you as being absent without leave. And should you be absent without leave for a period of time, let's say another 3 days, we will automatically invoke the right to dismiss you. I know it sounds draconian, but if you cannot enforce for a communication channeling now at this early stage, if you cannot establish the behavior of people informing you because they are in quarantine or medical quarantine or in a quarantine facility, that they inform you, formally inform you. Don't ask somebody else to inform you unless they are totally incapacitated, in which case you want a medical certificate to that effect. But if you do not inculcate that sense of discipline now, then it will become a precedent you set within your organization, not just for coronavirus, but it'll become a precedent that you set in your organization, that people can disappear at any moment in time, not have to enforce you, and simply come back a week or 2 weeks or sometimes a month later with a medical certificate to say they were in that state, and sometimes to even assert the fact that they couldn't get hold of you, which is likely. In many instances, it's highly unlikely. But remember, I'm talking to you as employers. It is what you are required to do to pass the obligation on to the employee, to absolve your sense of accountability and responsibility. And so you need to understand where that dividing line is and push for that dividing line and test the limits of that dividing line, because otherwise you'll be setting precedent within your organization that you're not going to be able to deal with down the line. Criminal exposure could be as little as being exposed to a fine or some kind of a sanction, to as much as, in fact, being imprisoned. And imprisonment is, in fact, also indicated. So I do need to say that imprisonment is actually also indicated. So you do need to be aware of the fact that there is criminal exposure that you might become liable to should things get out of hand. It's critically important, ladies and gentlemen, that you have a formal spokesperson's policy within your organization. Essentially, the chief executive officer needs to be the go-to person as the spokesperson in your organization. You should not be veering from that policy at any moment in time, both to the internal world and to the external world within your organization, being acutely aware of the fact that you don't want every manager talking about these things and your policies and your plans to all of your clients. You certainly don't want every driver and every employee doing the same kind of thing. So again, you need to be draconian in how you enforce that spokesperson's policy within your organization so that everybody understands that if there's messaging and a narrative to put out there in the marketplace, it has to come through the spokesperson within the organization, essentially through the CEO and maybe the public relations person within the organization and nobody else. As far as your internal policy is concerned, the CEO would then either himself or herself take that responsibility for communicating with staff or devolve it to the HR manager. But in both of those instances, it needs to be very, very clear. and essentially become a bilateral engagement policy that does not get changed at any moment in time. I would encourage you as CEOs in the organization, at least on a weekly basis, to put some kind of a notice out there, whether it's by way of email, whether it's by way of cell phone, whether it's by way of WhatsApp, or even on the notice board. But just as an update, what's happening in our company in this regard, if there are people of ill, to in fact note those people who are ill, so that everybody is aware of the fact, but at the same time not to cause mass pandemonium. Again, I say it's a science, it's an art, it's not a science. How you manage it is really up to the culture of your business. And if anything, this is going to test the veracity of your labor relations policies on the one hand, but also of your relationship with your staff on the other hand. In companies with transformation committees, it's critically important that the strategic document that is prepared gets put before that transformation committee. And remember, a transformation committee takes care of employment equity planning, takes care of workplace skills planning, and equally, it also then takes care of any of your triple BE engagement activities that you might have been engaged in up until then, and then obviously as these things evolve. But that transformation committee needs to be your go-to structure within the organization for high-level communication, and also for you to continuously get a feel of the temperature, and excuse the pun, but of the temperature around this coronavirus thing amongst your workforce, etc. Because the last thing you want to do, and what you want to avoid, what you really want to avoid in the course of all of your activities, is a mass walkout, is a mass stay at home, and sometimes even that takes place without you having forewarning of the fact that is in fact happening. You do not want that to happen, and the only way you can avoid or prevent that from happening is to have a proper communication strategy in place from the get-go. Again, before I carry on, any questions in this regard?
Nothing from my side, Ava.
Kerry, you want to ask a question?
Not at this stage, thank you. I will obviously consult with you at a later stage.
All right, okay. So let's carry on then, guys. Good. So your policy document that you put before your transformation committee should be a document that doesn't only talk generally about how you're managing coronavirus within the workplace, but how decision making needs to take place around all of your staffing issues, around any policy changes regarding learners, regarding interns, and regarding yes. I was asked the question, because of the economic downturn, if we are staying open as a business, should we and could we still commit to our learnership strategy, our internship strategy, and our yes strategy? And the answer is common sense. The answer is this, that if you have learners on a learnership, and they are going to be the only person within your organization to suspend, or their agreements or contracts to suspend because of a downturn, let's say in your production time within your organization, it is permissible, but it needs to be communicated. And importantly, if it's a funded learnership, you need to communicate it back to the seaters, etc., who might advise you differently. If it is a yes activity, then again, in abnormal circumstances, exceptional circumstances such as this, you would be able to suspend your yes contracts and agreement on a FIFO basis, or rather on a LIFO basis, last in, first out, but you would need to communicate back then to Yes for Youth, which is the statutory body which administers all of the Yes programs. However, what I do want to caution you on in the following is, let's say it takes 10 months for this thing to pick up and for us to get back, hopefully, to some kind of normality in the workplace. At that stage, triple BE will very squarely kick back into operation. And should you imagine that you're going to be able to suspend your verification activity lengthen your verification activity, you will be able to do that. There's no question about that. But in turn, what would that then say to the supply chain that you are supplying into? I would imagine that your clients and your customers would be very flexible and very understanding because they'll be in exactly the same boat. But you do need to always bear in mind the consequential damage you might be doing to your verification levels should you suspend the most material issues to do with verification down the line. Because even though verification might be suspended because of other priorities at this moment in time, you don't want to have to play catch up where essentially you're starting from the beginning again. Because make no mistake, verification agencies will apply their normal costs and expenses in terms of their verification activities. It isn't very difficult from a triple BE point of view to keep business as usual, but it is very difficult to play catch up should you let it go out of the window. Just before I carry on, I'm going to unmute you because there might be one or two questions around triple BE that someone might want to ask. Any questions in that regard? Okay, I'm going to mute you again because it doesn't seem to be that there are questions. All right, so moving on now. In that transformation committee, in other words, in the engagement forum that you're creating or that you've already had created in your workplace, you need to talk openly about what happens if this thing carries on for a long period of time. Even if we have not previously engaged in Section 189 processes, the likelihood is we're going to have to initiate Section 189 processes because of COVID, because of its impact in the general marketplace, and because of its impact on how we're doing financially within the organization. So you need to enliven your employee representatives in a transformation forum, an employment equity planning forum, or even your shop steward committee. But you need to enliven them to the notion that Section 189 can be initiated, should be initiated, might be initiated, or in fact was previously initiated, which we're carrying on with, so that people don't feel that Section 189 has been suspended. The question was asked of me, can we retrench during the time of the virus? The answer is absolutely you can. There is a procedural mechanism in place. I'm not answering the question, should you retrench? I'm answering the question, can you retrench? So there is a procedural mechanism in place. If it materially affects your operation and you need to retrench, or you need to go on half time or short time or whatever it is, then do so. Don't tell yourself that you can't, it can't be business as usual with Section 189. Be consistent with what you've started or with what you're intending to do. And in fact, if you were going to be previously making the case for 189, but the virus got there before you, make the case for 189 based on the evidence you had before the virus got to the marketplace. Because if you had the evidence then if anything, it's more pertinent now rather than less pertinent now. But make no mistake, the eyes of the world will always be with you. If you do engage in the Section 189 process, the eyes of the world will always be on you more acutely as to whether or not you're an uncaring, unfeeling kind of an organization. You are entitled to protect your bottom line. You are entitled to retrench. You are entitled to do a whole series of things which are 189 permissible because you need to do it. And you are not obligated to stop doing it only because the virus has arrived. But nevertheless, always be acutely aware of the impact it would have on your public brand and your public image as you go about, ladies and gentlemen, doing that. And I apologize for sounding crass, but remember, I'm talking to you as a group of business people. And so in the process, as a group of business people, I'm asking you to be acutely aware of these realities. Okay. Finally, on this issue of obligations as senior managers on the board, please be aware of the fact that you have to make a commitment. You're actually obliged to make a commitment to updating information, sharing information, and any decision-making communication which might take place along the way. So please understand that obligation. All right, so we now move to issues of staff management strategies in unionized and non-unionized in workplaces. And remember, please, that in a unionized environment where you have a plant-based agreement, you have a social partnership with the trade unions. The trade unions are your partners in participative management within the organization. They might have devolved that responsibility to the shop stewards in your organization, but any material action you take, you do need to notify the trade union of such material action. The fact, as an aside, that the CCMA is closed for business, that bargaining councils are closed for business, and that whatever you do is going to remain uncontested until such time as the CCMA and bargaining councils are open for business, doesn't provide you with an opportunity to be unlawful or unilateral or procedurally irregular, because it is always going to come back and bite you at some stage if you were to be like that. I urge you to understand the social partnership. I urge you to invite either your shop stewards or the trade union or both into, even if they're online sessions, just using your telephone conferencing facility on your cell phone or WhatsApp, or in fact Skype or GoToMeeting or Zoom. But I urge you to strengthen that social partnership, because remember, a good, strong relationship with a trade union makes it easier for you to communicate things with your staff members, to do things with your staff members, than in fact if you've got a trade union that has gone to war with you in that regard. And for those of you who think that trade unions have closed down, you need to have another think, because in fact they haven't closed down. For them it is business as usual, remembering of course that trade unionists get paid for the number of days they're in your workplace, not in their own workplaces. So you need to approach this thing understanding that principle all of the time. So in a non-unionized environment, it is critically important, ladies and gentlemen, for you to create that social partnership, and not for you to ignore the social partnership, not for you to do things unilaterally, but for you to engage with your workforce, for you to ask for them to nominate the equivalent of shop stewards, but essentially employee representatives that you can deal with on a high level, and that together with whom you can then go back and communicate back to the workforce on an ongoing basis. It would be a good idea, by the way, for you in terms of communication to create a WhatsApp group amongst your staff that you can then formally communicate with and to. For those of you who haven't created WhatsApp groups, it is a very effective mechanism for communication. And you can control who posts what on those WhatsApp groups, because sometimes, as some of my clients will know, it does get out of hand and you've got to manage it. The issues that you have to deal with your staff are issues of very often, not very often, but predominantly issues of behavior rather than performance. So for example, hygiene, social distancing, the maximum number of people in the work environment or within the department at any moment in time. You need to define special leave to be used as a plant level. This is one of those rare occasions, and please listen to the interview with both John Buerta and Johan Olafir again here, but this is one of those rare occasions where you have the opportunity to take your plant-based definition of special leave to new heights, to new levels, which might make a lot of sense for your employees, but also for the managers within your working environment. So I urge you to take note of that in your utilization of this concept of special leave. It doesn't just relate to what is in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act as a definition of special leave. It doesn't just relate to that. And as we've said from the beginning of today's discussion, you have to get your order, your leave order right. You need to know how you jump from normal leave to special leave to unpaid leave. And that sick leave ordinarily is something you need to keep in the bank for the occasions when there is medically induced or medically caused leave that has to be taken for enforced quarantine on the one hand, but potentially for all sorts of other things on the other hand, that you can only control if you've got leave banked. If you have leave in the bank. You also need to very, very clearly in writing, if you haven't done it, specify what unauthorized leave within your organization means. And there, remember, unauthorized leave means that leave that hasn't been applied for, employers who haven't been notified of the need of an individual to take leave or to go into quarantine, etc. It doesn't necessarily mean the length that the person has taken, unless you've only specified 5 days, but they've taken 10 days and they haven't got permission for those extra 5 days to be taken. The other issues, as I've said, you have to put on the table with your employees is a Section 189 process. And then getting to some of the more specific labor relations issues that you do need to be talking about and defining as you go through this process with your employees is the issue of management prerogative and the fact that ultimately managers have an obligation, but they also have a prerogative to be managing the production process. No employee has a right to change any component of the production process unless authorized by management. No employee has a right to change any way that production takes place in any way whatsoever within the workplace unless by management authorization. So you need to assert that management prerogative. You need to show that leadership. Your team leaders, supervisors, and first line managers need to show that management prerogative through leadership in the workplace sooner rather than later. You cannot let it get out of hand. When it comes to performance management, it is business as usual in terms of how you manage a person's job description, how you manage their performance in terms of the job description. You need your managers to understand that they need to be acutely aware of behavior rather than only competency in the workplace, because behavior will be defined by attitude, by insubordination very often, and by inter-staff disharmony when things get out of hand. And in performance management, you need to continuously emphasize the fact that you employ a person on an individual basis. You do not manage them on a collective basis. And that can really get out of hand in instances such as this. You do not manage them on a collective basis. One of the things you need to be aware of is that you've got to always be conscious of the fact that you're not unilaterally changing a person's conditions of employment or their job description. And so you need to be aware of the fact that if you're going to have fewer people at work and therefore more people have to do more than their own job so that the production process continues as is, you're going to be needing to vary a person's job description. And you need to be sensitive to what your own policy and procedure manual says about how you change a job description, how you supplement a job description, and how you intend to expect more from people during the course of in fact changing their job description. I know that a couple of people have spoken to me about this, so I'm going to at this stage unmute your microphones and ask you, is there anybody who wants to ask any questions or make any statements with regard to how you're performance managing in the time of COVID-19?
No, I'm fine with it, either.
All right.
I have no question.
No, I've got no comment either.
All right, good. Let's then move on again. Okay. Excuse my spelling of the word behavior there, by the way, but in terms of labor relations, the CCMA, the Bargaining Council, and in fact even the Labor Court is going to become aware of the culture of acceptance and the culture of sensitivity, or the lack of acceptance or sensitivity within your organization. You need to be aware of the fact that where you continue to manage, to counsel on performance-related issues, you don't blur the line between behavior and performance-related issues, and you don't allow your team leaders, supervisors, and first-line managers to blur that line between counseling on performance, which you're fully entitled to do, and counseling on behavior, where sometimes irrational, inappropriate behavior has more to do with a person's fears, their current state of play at home, the fact that they have to go home in a taxi that's absolutely chock-a-block full, the fact that they live within very close proximity of their neighbors, possibly even share ablution facilities, which all affects behavior, which undoubtedly affects performance. So you need to be aware that there is a heightened effect on performance by behavioral issues, by what's consciously within the culture of an individual, culture within your departments, and within your organization. You need to be aware of that, ladies and gentlemen, because otherwise you run the risk of an unfair labor practice claim in your organization, where the onus then transfers completely onto you to have to prove that there hasn't been an unfair labor practice. And if there isn't an unfair labor practice, then there's not an unfair labor practice. No one can allege something that doesn't exist. However, you don't necessarily want to be on the back foot the whole time, having to justify the fact that it doesn't exist. So during that counseling phase of the performance management process, because as you know, there is management, there is counseling, and then there's discipline. But during the counseling phase of the performance management process, be alert, be awake, be woke, as some of my friends might say, to the idea that the impact on performance might very well be the cause because of behavior, what's going on in the person's mind, and what they're exposed to in the home environment. So be aware and alert to that fact. As far as discipline and dismissal is concerned, stick to your rules. You have to here be sticking to your rules in terms of discipline, and you've got rules, or if you don't have rules, there are generally accepted ways of disciplining an individual and distinguishing between finding them guilty as opposed to punishing them. Just stick to the rules of how you're supposed to discipline. And when it comes to dismissal, dot your I's and cross your T's, knowing that at some stage, especially if there is no appeal internally, at some stage, the way you dismiss people, what you dismiss them for, and how you let them go is going to come under the spotlight. And you're gonna have to justify for it at that stage. The one thing I do want to say before we move on to the next item, and that is this, that we are going to see more and more remote hearings becoming possible within your working environment. So, for example, a neutral person who's a chairperson can more comfortably chair a disciplinary inquiry if it's over GoToMeeting or over Zoom or over Skype than necessarily being in the working environment. What you're also entitled to do is initiate disciplinary inquiries. If there is a lockdown, it doesn't mean that it's not business as usual on a remote basis. And if you've initiated disciplinary inquiries or wish to initiate disciplinary inquiries, you can do so on a remote basis. And you can also, by the way, have appeals on a remote basis. And the good thing, of course, about doing it on a Skype or a GoToMeeting or a Zoom is that you can record the session. And because you can record the session, you've got a natural record which can then serve for evidentiary purposes. Right, so now moving on then to the next topic, which is the topic of lockdown. And I can't believe the number of my clients who are talking to me about planning for a lockdown, as if a lockdown is around the corner. It might very well be around the corner. And when we speak this time tomorrow morning, we might be in lockdown or we might not be in lockdown. But if you're planning for a lockdown, again, it's advisable for you to engage with your employees, if there is an employee forum, or collectively with your employees about what happens if there is a lockdown in the business. The question was asked of me as to whether or not you ordinarily can trigger the leave provision and the unpaid leave provision in times of lockdown. And certainly if your business is locked down, then there is no question about the fact that leave is triggered. Whether you want to trigger or not is really up to you, but that leave is automatically triggered, that unpaid leave is consequently triggered. If there is a lockdown, I have no doubt in my mind that the unemployment insurance fund in the case of lockdown will be extended to employees. So as the quarantine leave has been extended to employees, where they will be covered for 70% of their salaries, if there is a medically caused or medically induced quarantine that an individual has had no option but to have to go on, they're covered for 70%. I've got no doubt in my mind that in times of a lockdown, the UIF will be triggered as well in that regard, for as long as the UIF will last. And that's critically important to also understand. For as long as the UIF provision, the amount of money in UIF will last, UIF will be triggered for that period of time. I've got no doubt about that. But as far as agreements are concerned, where you have an opportunity for people to work remotely, for example, your accounting division, for example, your planning division, your drafting division, etc., etc. In other words, everything except for, let's say, the blue-collar employees within your workplace, it is important that you initiate the draft agreement process now rather than waiting for that time, that you initiate the draft agreement process now. So you anticipate the fact that in the course of a lockdown, we're going to need a virtual agreement with those individuals so that they are kept to terms and conditions and provisions, such as, for example, non-compete provisions on the one hand, and on the other hand, confidentiality. So it's much better for you to almost have a supplementary agreement now to their contracts of employment that you ask them to engage with you in the instance, in the case, in the possibility of lockdown, rather than leave it until the lockdown phase. Because if there is a lockdown, there is going to be general pandemonium until things right themselves, and it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to enforce any kind of agreement at that stage if a lockdown has been ordered. And we are, I think, well advised that if there is a lockdown, the South African National Defence Force will also be called out to keep law and order on our roads and in our public facilities. So it's best to make provision now where you can with employees that you are able to keep working. Is it unfair? And this is something that the trade unions are already beginning to allege. Is it unfair for you to make those kinds of virtual agreements with staff who are able to work from home, whereas with blue-collar employees who are not able to work on a virtual basis, to simply require them to take leave? Yes, that very definitely might be considered to be unfair because of the very nature of work. Are you obligated to do anything about it? No. Should you do something about it? Yes. So what I am advising you to then do is to say that at least for a first period of any lockdown, where individuals are not able to work from home because of the nature of their work, the company will give them 5 days or 7 days or 10 working days of extra paid leave for the period of that lockdown, in lieu of the fact that they do not do the kind of work which would require them to work virtually or to work from home. That's obviously subject to your resources within your organization and your surpluses or anything you might have in reserve, your reserves in your organization. It is not a legal requirement. But do you need to be aware or woke to the fact that the trade unions will very definitely make something about this? Absolutely. And so you need to make provision for the fact that you might need to compensate your blue-collar workers more than you would your white-collar workers, only because your white-collar workers might manage to continue to work, whereas your blue-collar workers very definitely will not manage to continue to work. I know that that is a massively sore point, so I'm going to unmute your microphones at this stage in case anyone wants to ask a question. Okay, no questions. All right, moving on. Right, moving on then. Communication, as far as lockdown is concerned, is critically important. Obviously, communication with your customers and clients, but more importantly, with your workforce. This is the time that how you behave towards your employees will determine whether you retain the important part of your workforce when it's business as usual. This is that time. And so what I implore you to do is understand that your employee relationships at this moment in time have never been more important to you, ladies and gentlemen. Should you decide to be draconian and work by the letter of the law and essentially work to rule, then you will be in a situation where you expose yourself to the disloyalty of employees, to the lack of gratitude should you change your mind at any moment in time with those employees. So it is now where you need to show compassion. It is now where you need to bend over backwards, remembering that if you're in a tax positive situation, very few companies are still in a tax positive situation, but if you are in a tax positive situation, then all of those expenses, whether they're real or virtual expenses, all of those expenses you incur will be deductible expenses in any way. So it is critically important that your internal communication strategy your show of sensitivity and caring for your staff is critically important as you make provision for a lockdown. Is a lockdown unavoidable? I don't know. I don't necessarily think so, but certainly a lot of people do. I want to get now quickly onto another topic, which was the subject of the interviews that will be distributed to you, and that's the topic of an interview on insurance that I conducted with a partner at Weber Wenzel, again, funny enough, on the subject of insurance. And you'll hear there about the notion that you cannot automatically depend on whether business interruption is going to save you. Insurance for business interruption is in fact going to save you in your workplace, because in fact it is not. The reality is, when it comes to business interruption insurance, there has to be an incident that causes business interruption. The reality is that the insurance companies are out to lunch at the moment on whether or not they would accept coronavirus unless a virus kind of a scenario has been specified, which is highly unlikely in your insurance policy, and therefore that you cannot automatically rely on business interruption. Conventional wisdom dictates, however, that should insurance companies be flexing their muscles inappropriately, let's just say inappropriately, should insurance companies be flexing their muscles inappropriately, the reality is that there might very well be a class action which gets triggered here in South Africa. And if that is the case, and by the way, that interview is with this individual here, if you think your business interruption policy covers you for coronavirus, think again. But I will obviously be sending you the links to all of these interviews. And I implore you to listen to them if you can. But the reality then is, should you think that your business interruption cover is going to be triggered, it isn't automatically going to be triggered, and you need to be talking to your insurance agencies and distinguishing what your insurance agencies will say the insurance companies are calling the incident or the event. The insurance companies that come out now and say we will recognize coronavirus as the event in your insurance policy are the ones I think that will engender your loyalty going forward. But the real question is, how long will they have to cover you for business interruption? And that's where the issue becomes quite tricky. Where you are possibly covered is in your insurance policies for business interruption when it comes to force majeure. In other words, a force of nature that is uncontrollable, but where you make allowance for force majeure. And only you will know, and only your insurance agents will be able to tell you about that. But please listen to that interview. If you think your business interruption policy covers you for coronavirus, think again. I think it's critically important that you do take those aspects into account. Then coming towards the end of today's discussion, I want to address the issue of you anticipating relief. Well, we know that there are staff expenses due to self-imposed, or rather staff expenses due to self-imposed quarantine will not be covered by any UIF relief. But we know that staff expenses due to medically imposed quarantine will be covered by relief. As I've already said, and I will send you the Government Gazette in that regard. Possibly after today, there will be other staff expenses which are also covered by relief, either UIF or other kind of relief. We know that there is regulation that is due out. Well, we know that there is already regulation that is out, but that as of tomorrow, the small business website, government small business website, will be launched, and that small business website will make allowance for small businesses to set off their claims against a limited amount of government subsidy, which is intended to kick in. So the process will be, when that happens from tomorrow, that you will need to go onto that website, and I just want to quickly show you what I'm talking about, that you will need to go onto that website, As you can see, the box ticking down says that there are 13 hours until the small business development website is launched. The link to that website, by the way, was right at the very bottom of today's invitation to you, but that in 13 or 14 hours time, that small business development website will launch. And in the process of launching, that you will find out what small business assistance government intend to in fact give to small businesses that are out of pocket, that possibly have had to close their doors, etc., etc. We're anticipating initially that there will be a large amount of assistance to qualifying small businesses, but we do not know what that means, qualifying small businesses, and we wait with bated breath to find out. We also wait with bated breath to find out from the President later on today as to whether or not there will be additional general relief for losses that you are currently experiencing. We anticipate that if he does announce general relief, it will start with tax relaxations, in other words, from the Treasury and Finance departments, so that you will be allowed not to have to make certain payments over to SARS, and certain additional things will be allowed to be deducted, and that thereafter potentially additional rebate relief might be made available from the Department of Finance. As to what other government departments are going to bring to the party, we don't know whether our South African government is going to go as far as foreign governments have gone in terms of bond relief for 3 or 4 months, and debt relief to bank and lenders for a period of time as well. The jury is out on that, but you can't run your businesses as if you know that's going to happen, or if in fact you're going to be dependent on that kind of relief. So I'm urging you not to in fact do that. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, I do apologize for having gone 10 minutes over time. I did say initially 45 minutes, and now it's been an hour. I apologize for having gone 10 minutes over time. I'm going to unmute your microphones and ask you please to just have a general discussion with me. Anything you want us to investigate further and come back to you on, or anything you want to bring to the attention of the people who are still online.
As a matter of interest, just on the subject of workmen's compensation, if anyone is infected at work, was they given the right to claim under workmen's?
Sorry, I've had to mute everyone's microphone again. Aggie, I'm going to unmute your microphone. Just give me a second, please. Right, Aggie, sorry.
Yeah, just on the subject of workmen's compensation, if someone's infected at work through this virus, has that person got a right to claim under under workmen's compensation?
Sorry, just say that again. If someone is infected at work because of the virus, does that individual have the right to claim workmen's compensation? If they're infected
or
at
the
work,
firm to claim, yeah.
If they're infected,
Sorry,
the way workmen's compensation works at this moment in time, if it is an act which is directly attributable to the workplace, in other words, where you've said, please, if you're infected or if you know you're positive, don't come to work, and you've taken action like that, and an individual then does get infected at work, I would refer to that as the back door to workmen's compensation. And until such time as it is specifically excluded, from the definition of what is eligible under workmen's compensation, the answer would be yes.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Let me unmute everyone's mic. Yes, sorry, who's that? Brian. Yes.
Hi, Brian.
All right, so just give me a second, just for benefit here. I'm just going to do this. Right, Brian. Yes, sorry, the mic is yours.
Either yes. Just a point. Assuming we do go into lockdown, I can imagine that the state would most probably do a regional lockdown. In other words, take out Gauteng and Western Cape. Now, under those circumstances, if I've got branch offices in some other cities, do I allow those branches to then continue as normal without any interference whatsoever, but without basic support from head office?
So, Brian, if if it is a regional or provincial lockdown that takes place and not a national lockdown that takes place, and if your head office, your main supply chain factor is taken out in the process, then you would be required to close the whole operation down if it's dependent on the supply chain. If it's for marketing purposes, then you would keep it open. But if the supply chain, which comes from a province which has been closed down, is affected, then you would be required on the supply chain basis to close down the entire supply chain operation of your organization. If there is a province which remains open, the people who work in the supply chain, in other words, goods receiving, goods dispatching, etc., might be required to do extra cleaning, extra stock taking, etc., etc. You're fully entitled to require them to be at work if there is not a closure of that facility, if there is not a national lockdown. If it's a national lockdown, then obviously you need to close your entire operation down.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I know there was somebody else who put their hand up.
Yeah, I've just to tell everybody, we've posted all your interviews and the articles that they related to on our website.
Thanks. That's James Scott, and that's Business Brief. Thank you, James. Right. I will send a link out to Business Brief so that you can find it all on Business Brief. Any other questions or points that people want to make?
I think just thank you for the great talk and information passed on. How do we as businesses balance between social distancing and bringing people into the labor force? On the one hand, we want to keep our businesses running. On the other hand, we want to be as good employers that don't want our people getting sick or in South Africa coming into a standstill. How would you advise us to balance that very fine line?
So the reality, and thanks for that, Brian. I mean, the point is this. It is highly unlikely that if you call people into meetings at your workplace, that they're literally going to come to your workplace. It is highly unlikely that that's going to be the case, unless in your communication strategy, you can tell them that you have created engagement pods which have nothing to do with your main workplace, which are not likely to be traversed by your employees, which have been made totally hygienic, which are closed off. Sometimes you might want to do it on a remote basis, by the way. But certainly, if you take that kind of action with them, it might become a marketing tool, funnily enough, for you to do that. We've created special zones for one-on-one interaction, rules in those zones, where, for example, no one who is tested positive can come into the zone, etc. No one in quarantine can come into the zone, etc. It might become a marketing tool or it might not. But are you going to manage to induce people to come into your business? Absolutely not. Should it be business as usual? No, because it gives you an opportunity to do something that would normally, and for the ladies, well, I'm not going to use that word, but it would cheese off your customers sometimes. And that is to re-engage with bulk emailing, with group WhatsApping or individual WhatsApping, where you can actually say to people, please read these messages this time. Don't just sin bin them, but read them. Because what we're telling you is that we're moving our marketing activities, our engagement activities online because of coronavirus. It is part of our policy not to depend on face-to-face engagement, but rather to be innovative. With virtual engagement with our client base over there. If you as a company want to appoint an engagement officer, tell us who your engagement officer is, and we will engage with that person who can then set up additional virtual meetings within your business. I think this is a perfect opportunity for innovation like that, Brian. And let's be honest, you're in the world of innovation. That's what Fishwicks does. You're in the world of innovation. So be innovative and create something of this bad situation where you reinvent what marketing means on a virtual basis, that it's not just about social marketing, but more importantly, it's now about those critical meetings that need to take place, but online. Institutionalize the notion of online selling and online interaction. The other Brian Randall, I want to say this to you. This might give you an opportunity to neutralize the effect of unwelcome people going on site with many of your clients and having undue influence on site, where you say to the buying and procurement and the supply chain divisions of your clients out there, We have a virtual selling activity we're engaging in now because we don't want to infect you. We don't want to enforce shutdown of your plants because we were the cause of that shutdown. But in return, we're asking you to talk to us, give us consideration, understand that we're looking out for you, our clients, our possible clients. So make something of what generally would be a very negative situation. I think there's never been a better opportunity for you to establish virtual marketing, virtual selling than now. And what you're also going to find, and Kerry, you might find this as well in terms of your operation, but what you're also going to find, it's going to cut down on your overheads. It's going to cut down on your transport overheads, on your petrol overheads, on your flying overheads. And I mean, let's be honest, these are things that many of you are regularly complaining to me about, that your staff are unnecessarily going out there when they could be talking directly to the people online or on the cell phone. And in fact, a lot of those engagements could very well be being recorded at the same time so that you can track sales activity in a much more organized fashion. Now's the time to be creative. Brian, I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, thanks, Ava. Yeah, thanks so much.
And maybe Brian, in response, certainly I think for marketing departments, and I suppose Tara, I'm talking to you, the other Brian Randall, I'm talking to you. Maybe what we want to do is run a specific session like this, but for marketing and for sales departments on how to make something of this bad situation. We'll pick that up.